everybody, and welcome to another Agile IT webinar. Today, we're going to be talking about managing multi-cloud and on-prem servers with Azure. And quite a stack of tools. How you doing today, Conrad?
Doing good. Excited to talk about this.
Yeah, I've managed to pick your brain on this a few times, so I'm excited to see what you're presenting. Take it away.
Okay, so so this is a topic that we've been talking a lot about customers, especially now. I mean, there's one of the biggest things that most organizations right now is they've either moved into Microsoft 365 or stayed on-prem. It doesn't matter. You still have all this infrastructure. And a lot of this infrastructure really could be placed really all over the place. And one of the things that so in terms of what we'll talk about in summary at the end as we go through this is kind of what should be the transition plan as you go and look at leveraging these services. Is it broadcasting all right?
I believe so.
All right. It's just a little window that was still stuck on my side. Sorry about that. So as we're looking at these servers infrastructure, and there's times when we're thinking, well, some of these servers are going to go away. Should I do them now? But there's other kind of key drivers that's really forcing people to look at how do I get my arms really wrapped around this and kind of the approach in terms of small stepping stones that are really critical to kind of get you there, and what are all these different pieces. So hopefully as we go through this, there's not as much demos I thought I would really want to go through this, but I think what is important is conceptually what are the areas that we can leverage Azure to really bring these servers together to essentially augment or improve what you already have today. Kind of why a lot of people would come here and go through this. So again, you may have a lot of servers that's on-prem, and maybe it's in another cloud. You have some things in AWS, you have some things in Azure. And one thing that's really important for customers to understand is you may not have any server infrastructure that's inside of Azure, and it may never go inside of Azure, although I don't think that'd be the case. But you can still leverage all of these tools that Azure as a service, kind of as a managed service management backplane, security, compliance, that it can help you now where you are without feeling that, well, if I have to manage things through Azure, do I have to change a lot of things? And the answer really is no, you don't have to change really anything where you are, but most of the times you're looking to transition or modernize as you go. And the other thing that's kind of driving is many times we have IT management solutions that are out there. Some of it might be like System Center Configuration Manager, or you're buying other third-party tools. But how do I still pull them all together in order to make the momentum that I want? The others, there's compliance requirements, and we have a lot of customers that either move into Azure for Microsoft 365 because they have compliance requirements, banking requirements, health requirements, defense requirements, and they've done all this work to move their users, their data, identity all into the cloud, but they still have all this other infrastructure, which many times is part of an audit. Not only if it's a part of an audit, but we have to think about the cybersecurity view of this. And so, as we go through this, you don't necessarily have to lift and shift everything if you don't want to. There's different approaches you can have to slowly layer these things on. But what are the right things? What are capable? So as we go through this, hopefully some topics you may have looked into. I think the Q&A is probably going to have a lot of questions. So please feel free to put them in here. We'll answer them as we get towards the end. But also looking at your cybersecurity. So many times we think about the basics of management of what we're going to go do. And again, for us, and here at Agile IT, everything we do is on the Microsoft side of it. But when you're looking at what the Microsoft platform can do for customers, especially Azure, now you're touching things in Google, AWS, on-prem. You might have a Linux OSs and Postgres and Kubernetes. You have this whole mix, and so that's really what made it exciting for us as we talk to customers of what you can do with those things. So first off, let's just think about managing across clouds. One thing is on-premises is cloud. There's a wonderful graphic. I don't think I have permission to show. It's kind of public venues that, the picture where there's, a server underneath somebody's desk, and like, is that the cloud? Well, I guess it could be. Really these are internet-based connected services. Many times you're going to have, really sophisticated management tools that's in your query, and we often forget about these other little pieces that somebody might have a server someplace, and can we keep management or view of that? Yes, you can. If it's an AWS, if it's sitting on a VMware cluster, if it's a Kubernetes thing deployed at a colo, can we get our arms around this? Yes, we can. And that's really the nice thing about this, is that where you are, how you are, let's get those things together. And management isn't just, well, I got to make sure they're patched, but seriously important to make, not only to patch them, but ensure they're being patched. And especially, are they being patched with the things that we need? And overall, if you look at the landscape of things, you can buy all these different point solutions that work really good for their space of it. But it normally is like, well, this one team or this one person runs this one area to do CVE scanning, and then now we know. But then we work with something else that does our patch updates, and they're not really the same. And then, then we do logging. We have event logs on our individual computers, and maybe we use another thing to collect those logs and put it in a different service. And we also have, the antivirus and kind of security things that's also on that computer, and it's stored someplace else. And that the problem with this is that, they're so disparate from one another. Normally we fill the gaps with either another expensive tool, or we inundate our IT professionals to try to aggregate those, make sense of those. So you're kind of working hard to pull those things together, and you tend to prioritize the things that are important, which business critical applications. But it's always that one thing that doesn't seem nearly as important, that doesn't have that same focus all the time, where you get attacked or where it's just not following the process and you didn't know it. So part of this is just understanding the landscape at what you have, and you don't necessarily have to move everything at once. You can do them in phases, and that's kind of a recommendation. Start small, but be mindful of what you do as you go along. And part of this is that a lot of the IT skills of how we pull that together. You might have one person, it might be you, that's been doing it there for the last 5 to 6 years. But then people tend to get promoted. They tend to retire. They go off and do something else. They get sick or whatever it is. And they're the ones banding it all together, which also creates a big challenge for others to learn it, lose capability. So, it's not to say that when you go into Azure, everything is just, click, and it's all done for you. But it's a more integrated approach that you have, and you can do it in time as you move along. So as we talk about here about what some of those key things, one of the biggest ones is Azure Arc. So the nice thing about Azure Arc, this service is available in commercial, it's also available in government. And really Arc, when you think about it, the graphic here is kind of telling, if you will, is really bridging the gap between what are things in Azure. So it used to be, if you want all these great tools inside of Azure that does inventory collection and security analysis and compliance and all of these other great services, you need to be in Azure. But that makes it really hard for organizations that either have a really good reason to stay on-prem, whether it's healthcare applications and services, manufacturing, that might be, whatever that is, that you might always need them there, or they're just there for now. That, what do I do for that? So really Azure Arc is the one that connects it, together, just so that one, there's an awareness as a whole, and start to unify the view of, yes, those are all of our servers, and we can have a way inside of our infrastructure to continue to capture those, so that we make sure we can set policies that cross not only a policy that's in Azure for your VMs, that's on-prem for your VMs, it could be across multiple clouds. We've seen it where customers have things in AWS servers that are there. Their identity services are in Microsoft 365. They also have some on-prem domain controllers that they might have. Already, you're in cross-cloud in what you're doing. And normally what happens is, well, if I need to manage the servers that are in AWS, I have to go do one thing. If I have to go look at Google, I have to do another thing. And part of it's because our developers put the applications in AWS, but we put all of our things on-prem and GCP and Azure. So you have this mixture that you also need to support across teams. So again, Azure really makes it nice because the available infrastructure that they have to span across these environments. So the other part that goes with it, I'll talk more about it towards the end, is really the Defender for Cloud pieces of it, so that we can both understand not only what devices are there, but to start to protect them and start to understand what's happening in them, so that we can see that there's some security vulnerabilities that are out there, and I can apply policies. And this will be a thing that I continue to talk about, this whole thing. It's something that you could write down as a note that keeps it there is that you get to start to have unified policies and views across your servers and infrastructure. And by the way, it's not just servers, we'll talk more Kubernetes, IoT devices. If you have that, consistent policies across your different properties and assess them across your different policies or your environments. And so that's the other key thing. So you can have things like Azure policy. I'm not going to talk, much in depth about that, except for that with Azure policy, you're able to define certain things like, hey, if you're a Linux device of this type, you need to have these certain rules enforced in terms of, what do we allow in terms of applications that get installed? What versions are they allowed to have? What security things in terms of what we want their passwords to behave? And yes, this will work with things that are on-prem in Azure, GCP, wherever it is for Windows, as well as Linux. And there's other Arc vendors out there. VMware is one of them. Nutanix is another one where Arc really understands those vendors and provides even more security and management that you can have for them. But again, Defender for Cloud allows you to do this across those different properties. So when we think about the three things that Arc is really allowing you to do, and then for you, as part of your homework as we go along through this or your notes, is really thinking, well, there's servers, traditional view of a server to Windows OS with whatever's on there. It could be a domain controller, it could be a web server, it could be a file server, it could be just a plain server that's in a local AD or not, but it's running some line of business application. It could also be Linux based that you have. So those have some very specific kind of grunt work OS things that it needs to work with. But then there's more contextualized ones, such as Azure Arc for Kubernetes. So if you have applications that you already have because you've built them and you have developers or other people in infrastructure who decided to really leverage the Kubernetes infrastructure to essentially map how you do your deployments, your updates across whatever that is, you can bring them into Azure Arc too. So not only just understanding the servers that are there, but the Kubernetes infrastructure that's inside that you want. And there's also the data services, and this is the part where you can actually have data services that's like in Nutanix, for example, and it's run as a managed SQL instance, and you want to automate certain things like performance, where you may want to give it more resources at a certain time, less resources at another time. So it can work with some of the infrastructure you have, as well as VMware, and Hyper-V has some things as well. So now you start to look at, I can actually manage through cloud services at scale that also, by the way, has the ability for your deployments to be able to be managed, controlled, approved, rolled out, tested, all that in scale in one area. So, as we look at the improvements that we get to have through the cloud, whether that's, we have a number of customers where they're still going to need to have infrastructure on-prem. Again, manufacturing is a really good one, healthcare, retail services. So we have these edge services that we need, but I need to have a view of them in concert with all of the other pieces that I have, because oftentimes they're managed separately in separate units. And it's not to say that you have to get rid of all of your other pieces either, but you'd like to have oversight across all of those different properties as much as possible, and really start to benefit from the unification of all of them as you move along. So you can still leverage all of the things that you're doing in terms of your deployment of like GitHub, DevOps, deployments, where it gets deployed, on-prem, in the cloud, in GCP. So really, hopefully this opens your eyes that through just this beginning capability, what you can do, you can now start to affect all of those other pieces without having to feel that they're so individualized, I can't get the benefit, because from a business side of it, you do need to. And so here, sorry, graphics not so good, but here in this side of it is where inside of Azure, you're able to start to get that view of, oh, here's my different virtual machines, and understand where they exist. So you can start to also tag these sorts of things. So you can understand, oh, these resources belong to this team. I can even put them into different resource groups, even though that resource really lives on-prem or in GCP. You might have an environment where we have a number of servers that we deploy. We deploy them in production at AWS because that's where it is, and we don't want to move it at this point. But we also want to give our developers access to it in Azure to do some of the work. And by the way, we have some things on-prem that's not our developer team. You might not even have one, but let's say you did. But we also have our enterprise infrastructure for our local Active Directories, our file servers. It could even be other devices such as network devices as well. And you want to have a global view of what those things are, because now you can start to do other things with them, which I'll talk about in a few, around compliance and security. So again, not only having them here, it's like, oh, great, another web portal, which is nice, and you can put policies out and automation across them. But what are some of the biggest things that you get when you put things into Azure from an IT perspective? Well, one, consistency. So if I wanted to look at all of the different servers that I have by a particular resource group, because that's how we target, either our enterprise in the West and the East, or applications. But now I can script those things in PowerShell, pull from that backplane of information without having to do what a lot of internal IT people will do, which is like, oh, I created a PowerShell script. I do that all the time, but it has to run on-prem on my laptop. It connects to each server just to ask the basic questions of when was the last time you restarted, or when was the last time you refreshed. All that information can get pulled in through Azure Arc into Log Analytics, where I can ask those questions. So, the fact that I can see them here is great, but the ability to then automate certain things, collect data from it, visualize the data, even from like Power BI, just starts to open the door for things that perhaps you weren't able to do beforehand. So when we think about the deployment, so one thing just to come out with this, and this is kind of a nice segue into this, is that the Arc enabled service, it's an agent. Right? I mean, we live in the world of agents for many years. And even when you deploy the Arc agent, there are additional extensions you can have in that, like Defender is another extension, Log Analytics is another extension that you would apply, where it would push down the agent on there. Well, my server's already got enough agents. Well, okay. And if you're transitioning, then you would put the Arc agent and any other extension for like Defender for Cloud or Log Analytics to start to collect those properties. And then if you move off the other ones, you can remove them. But this is one of the reasons why you can actually deploy this into really anywhere that it exists. Hey, I have this, this is not a really good enterprise scenario, but to give you an idea, I have this, server that's sitting essentially at my house, and I do a lot of development on it and testings on it. Would that work? I mean, I got like a simple firewall here. Do I have to open ports? No, you don't have to open up any ports. There's some network requirements, in terms of the IPs that it's allowed to go through. Once you deploy the agent, it does a heartbeat check about every 5 minutes, so that it reports it up in Azure, so you can see if there's a down service or that requires remediation or communication. But you deploy the agent that's on there. Different ways to be able to deploy those agents, one by one, group policy. It's really nice. There's integration with the Windows Server. Was it the admin, the Windows admin tool? So on one server, you can tell it there, and it can deploy to all the other servers. So if you're using that kind of thing, you can do that there. Lots of different ways that you can get it deployed out. But once it's there, now you can start to collect other information, and you're able to start, and push down the other resources that would be, Defender for Cloud, and deploy that wherever we want. And then you're able to start to provide auditing. So now, even just there, I have Azure Arc in there. I put Defender on there. So now I'm starting to collect information into a unified view of this. So now that I'm able to do this, I can leverage many of the same services that all the benefits that used to only be in Azure now can be spread down to all of those other pieces, no matter what you have and what the flavor you have. Each one of these has even more in-depth places around the type of integration, like for let's say Azure Arc enabled PostgreSQL, if you were using something like that, and it was running on one of the vendors that's Arc native, I think that's what it's called, or integrated, where you can actually say, hey, if it needs more resources, because you bought all this expensive. I'm saying Nutanix all the time, because one that I hear from customers that hey, we have this investment, we still like this investment, we still want to do these things. What can Azure Arc and just Azure as a whole? Well, it could work with it, so that way it can be a part of your policy of scaling things up and down. Guess what? When you have those logs or define those rules, they're all inside of Azure. So one of the other areas when we look at just the insights of information that we get. So my favorite one that I like to go through, seems super basic, but it's on the log capture side. So all these servers, whether they're in, let's say they're Windows servers, even Linux has some logs or log data. One of the problems that those logging services is that they do a great job. They get the logs, they keep your logs low so that way you don't lose them, because if there's a hack or something going on, you want to get it. But normally the users that it sees, the timestamps that it has, it's understanding who it is. Normally it's in its own kind of format, and you could have done some integrations, but if there was a security alert or if there was a problem happening in an application, most of the time somebody goes to that service that the application runs on, does the query and does whatever, and then they try to upload maybe some of that data into something else. When really want to have a unified view of all that data that gets rolled up either into the Defender product or into something like Sentinel and maybe your own SIEM services, but you want to be able to see that all across the board. Another good example of this is in terms of the automations that you can do around it is, it's common with some applications, especially older ones, for whatever reason, under a certain threshold or a certain period of time, it needs to be rebooted, it has to be cleaned, things have to be updated. And when that normally happens, oftentimes, and some of this is not different, where one of the IT people, whoever internally, externally, they'll create a script. And then they'll put that script, run an command or schedule command on the Windows server, and it'll go run it. And they go, how do you know that it's working? Well, if it doesn't break, I guess it works. Or maybe it writes something to the event log. You can get that same script, put it in what's called Azure Automation, targeting one of the Arc machines, which is on-prem, and it will run that script that you've defined, kept track in Azure, and it'll tell you not only has it ran, when it failed, and if it failed, we can create alerts and rules that says somebody needs to take action, or we already know there's another remediation action, and that can be automated. And it's all stored in the cloud versus, hey, I had that script, I put it there. A lot of times we'll create a script, maybe there's a repo, a lot of times there isn't. They put it on there and like, what's it doing? Did it run? So you're doing these individual pieces versus put it in the cloud and then leveraging that, because you might need to do that same process across different machines in different areas. And who can update that script? When did they update that script? When did it fail? When did it go? And having that all captured in the cloud allows you to just have instant access to that versus let me remote desktop into those areas. So that's kind of just a story of one of those pieces. And again, when you're thinking about your security side of it, monitoring it for patch updates is critical. It's one of the basic hygiene. You wake up in the morning, you brush your teeth, take a shower, you take the trash out, make it bed. Basic hygiene things. But when problems arise, you need to have that collection of information. And lack of information and lack of consistency of information is what crushes organizations when there's a cyber attack and during audits. And every audit normally is aligned to either industry regulation, but a lot of it's especially look at the defense industrial base side of it with cybersecurity maturity model certification, CMMC, or if you're doing ITAR, FedRAMP High, a lot of that compliance is to ensure that there's good policy and coordination of information so that, if to try and minimize the attack or minimize the effectiveness of the attack and so on and so forth. And so getting all of that data together in time is what becomes crucial. So things like Azure policy that lets you define rules of what gets installed, what not to. The Azure Monitor, this is what gets the log data from on-prem or one of the other clouds consistently going into Sentinel. All these things tend to stack up. You don't have to do them all at once. You can do them in pieces, right? And really, if you can target by application or department to start, formalizing some of these areas, they're not meant to really to restrict capabilities. They're meant to to enforce policies that you might have. You may not even be in an industry that's required to mandate this. You may not be in a part of audit, but you typically have business IT policy that says, how do we need to manage and support it and reducing your risk of attack? So pulling all these services together are key in terms of what you're going to go do. So Azure Arc, like I said, is the middle part of it. It is the gateway into when you deploy it. So for Azure Arc, and please, we talk about pricing and all that, and there's some key things, but I'll try and cover a couple of bits. If you have an Arc device and you just say, well, I want to see it up in Azure, that doesn't cost you anything. When you start to turn on things like Azure Automation that pulls inventory, so you can see differences of inventory, applications, update management, well, those services will start to cost you money. Depending on the device, depending on your the region and where the Azure Arc is available, because you'll say, what's the difference between doing this in West 2 or something else? And sometimes they'll have different prices, and same thing if you're doing this on the Azure government side between Virginia and Arizona. So there's some adjustments of prices for some things. I think that ones are about the same. But as you start to add those on, you can control it in terms of what goes there, and the amount of data that you want to be pulled up. That's also something you have to factor in. But just starting to get your whole view of things isn't going to cost you anything. Again, there might be a specific one in here, like for the SQL data part of it. Once you see that costs money. So, but just getting the servers up there is kind of the right first start. And you can start off really simple, in terms of getting a few devices that are up there, like you have a couple servers on-prem, a domain controller, something else. You can get it in there and start to slowly put things in there and see your cost and see the effectiveness. And these are projects that we do for customers to kind of get them ongoing. So again, when we really think about all of the Arc-enabled services that you're able to go get, there's quite a bit that you can start to govern and manage those areas. Again, it could be a server that's not a VM. It's a pure OS on disk. You don't see a lot of those these days, but they still exist. Large SQL databases, large line of business applications. They're thirsty and they just want to be all there. There's ways to do that effectively, but it'll work there because it's an agent. Windows, Linux, you deploy the agents on there and they'll start to connect up. And once they connect up, you really do see them in Azure with those resources, and then you can start to define policies. Now, you do want to think a little bit forward in terms of, well, when we put these things out here, and we do start to connect it, probably want to create a different resource group for it so you can define policies that target for it. You could change them later on, but try to start off with those areas, and you probably have a natural grouping that you have already. And so those resource groups could be tied to a business unit, an application, certain types of resources. There's something called the Cloud Adoption Framework. That's worth looking into. It's basically a kind of a implementation or a guide of how to pull these things together, because there could be quite a bit. But again, if I was going to have somebody that could manage the patches or manage those areas, I can do that inside of Azure with my Azure Arc devices, and I can target which people have access to that, and set it up. And when it's set up properly, when you do this, when they make changes, that's also logged. When they make, when there's something that they removed or whatever, that's also logged. So really key for a compliance perspective and accountability, because oftentimes people will make changes directly on the server or something else, and we're not sure who did it. When did they access? So it holds everybody in the organization accountable to what is happening and when it's happening. So again, being able to do Defender for Cloud with Arc in all of these different properties, not only is it capable, it's designed to do it. And then when you think about it from I'm sorry, I was gonna, just give me a second. Yes, so when we really think about it from an architecture, so we talk about like the data services, it gives us better insight into our compliance. So again, the Arc data services, so this is the one where we're able to start, getting more sophisticated, where we have these, this Kubernetes environment. It's, it's not here in Azure. It could be in Azure. It could be someplace else. And I want to be able to pull information from it, inventory logging. There's ability to do direct or indirect access for Kubernetes for the application. It could be for security reasons or performance, and you want to pull inventory information for billing. So if it's a direct one, which most of the times most people will use the direct view of it, you can also get insight to the billing aspect of it, so you can look at that through Azure Arc. So pulling all of that together for things that are in Azure, for things that are on-prem, just continue to benefit the organization. And really it's when you think about this, hopefully it is there's a direct view that I normally see. Well, I have these other tools that does the logging, I have these other things that do this, but really start to think about how do they come together? What work do you have to do together? And it doesn't necessarily mean you have to replace everything. Some things may need to stay the same, but if you can start to at least unify them, create consistent logging and information, like I said, you could do that with what you have now, and then start to do some comparison on the benefits and the costs that you have. Now, when you start to have all of this in Azure Arc, and there's a Defender for Cloud that's being pulled in as well, now you start to see other information around like security. So now in one view, you can start to look at oh, look at all my AWS subscriptions, my GCP projects that I have in there, some things in Azure. What is my unified view in terms of regulatory compliance? Now, there's some that Microsoft has built in that are there. There's others that have been added in and continue that are specific to things like CMMC. Obviously, some updates happening for V2, but specific that's happening for this. And we're not even talking about the users that normally have their own compliance view of the data and SharePoint, all this. This is about my infrastructure that I have that I'm able to pull in there, even though they don't live inside of Azure. And that's really the other benefit from a snapshot view of this, is I get to start to get that unified view, and I can take action, and I can see the history that's inside of it. So I'm able to start to pull those properties together without, again, having to change everything in my environment, which is always the biggest fear, right? Which is, well, if I got to do this, I got to migrate things, or I got to open up new ports. I got to put a whole new server and deployments. You don't have to. You don't need to. And if you're going to eventually make a transition, so guidance I tell customers all the time, if this server is that important and you have to meet compliance, but you plan to get rid of it in 6 months, deploy it through Arc now. Keep track of it. One, it can only help you in collecting information you're going to want as part of your migration. The second thing is, security people don't take time off. The hackers don't take time off. Auditors tend to want to think about now and what you have. And sometimes your desire to move may go longer. And because you're doing this as the service as you need it, well, at the time you migrate away from it because you went to a SaaS thing, or did it Microsoft Power Platform, whatever it is, as soon as it goes away, that cost goes away. But you would want to have this now early on. So, something to really think about early on you can do, and getting this insight. So if you're the CIO or IT manager, to have other people, including, well, I have another MSP that manages those servers for me. Fine. They probably have their own agent that pulls things and does whatever. You may get insight into that, oftentimes not. You may get a report to them. You get really good ones, will give you some. Why not also collect this for yourself to have another view of accountability? Is it going to bother you for the server? I think, again, don't hold me to the pricing. This is recorded, so it could change tomorrow and I could have it wrong. But I believe to do the with Arc on the Windows server in, I think I was looking at Virginia Government Cloud, and doing the inventory patch update, there was something else I forgot. It was like $750 a month, right? Not going to break you. Shouldn't. If you got 10, $75 to get this view of it, and you can keep using your other applications and then decide like, hey, that's doing great. And to have two things that tell you that is not bad. If you see that there's some big gaps, well, now something to take a look at. So, getting started with that from a security footprint standpoint is key. And again, here also on the Defender for Cloud side of it is a regulatory compliance. So you can start to say that this requirement for, ISO or SOC or whatever that might be, has specific requirements, and this will tell you. And as you make changes to it, some of the policies, by the way, it'll tell you some things don't get captured for another 12 or 24 hours. Other ones will be immediate. So if you look and clicked on one of these and it said, oh, you have these things, if you fix it, we'll update the score. Okay, but now you get a history of the score. So you can download it directly. There's other tools that we've created, some tools to export it, on a frequent basis, so that you can have a snapshot at some point. Auditors know that things happen and things adjust and whatever. They just want to see that you saw it, communicated, you took action, saw it again, you validated, you're good. But it allows you on a periodic basis to make sure things are happening. And these are things that we have a service called Agile Max for infrastructure that we continuously want to look at these things. In some areas, we know we can just fix on our own. We talk about customers and improve our own books. Others, we have to get the involvement like, hey, do you did this? That yes, okay, but this is what the score is. But the main thing here is that this score and information is happening across your different infrastructures and platforms, so that you can see how are you measuring up to stay on pace. Because it's a big question customers have, not only with what they do in Microsoft 365, but certainly with their infrastructure, and combined, you need to know where you are in terms of your footprint. So again, still getting this benefit of doing these things, and I haven't had to change my overall infrastructure and doing what's there. So this part here, in terms of the inventory part of it, a lot of this comes, there's the Azure automation, but there's the inventory side of it here. I may want to find out what applications do I have that I'm servicing across all of my different servers, right? And this could be important because sometimes, like, just fun story where whenever I talk to customers and they say, oh, we have this application that we need. It's like, where is it deployed? Who manages it? When's the last time this? Like, I don't know. I have to ask somebody. I think it's this server. So let me log in. I'll remote desktop and see if it's in the start menu. Let me, SSH and use PuTTY, and let me go find this out, because that's the easiest way that they can do it. But what just happened there? You're working on the memory of people. You having to have direct access, and you're not able to aggregate that view of it. So what if we have a bigger question that we have involved in terms of updates that we need to happen? What changes have happened during that period of time? Who made those changes? Much harder to deal with. We in the IT industry try to do as best we can through written and communicated, a process, but that often breaks down because when there's a sense of urgency, those things tend to go out the window. We try to catch up and we don't. So, again, still means that we have to do the right things inside of the environment so we can have these kind of managed environments and collect that information and organize in the way that's right and audit it. But now we don't have to do it across, different platforms. Let me log in to Nutanix. Let me log on to this server over here. Let me go to, GCP and let me see what that server is doing and what it has over there. And I've had to buy 3 different tools because they're different. I mean, it's just a headache. And the whole thing is like, I just need a question answered. So the ability to have it there is great for the IT person. From the business side of it, it reduces risk, right? The less things that I have to manage, both licensing and support, train, people transition, train them again, and which means I have a gap of capability. And if I can put more into a consistent system, without having to affect the overall, architecture, because that's always the biggest fear and cost, the better it can be. Now, all of this data that you're able to start to do, whether it's in Defender for Cloud and you have this data, you can start to layer on other things, right? So this is the things, like you get it connected, you see what's there, you start to collect information around compliance policies, you start to set policies around security. Now I can start to say, well, can I start to tag and label data that is stored in an Azure cloud or stored someplace else? And can I start to label them directly using Azure Purview, which is really the compliance features. So this is things where you see like Compliance Manager, that was kind of part of it in one area that it collects. Purview is a whole big thing, but it can actually do understand your data estates, especially when it's in here. You can see in blob instances, but also SQL. So you can start to collect that thing. So anyway, integration with Purview is there that you can start to leverage ongoing, even if your servers are on-prem. So again, you start to look at, as you stack these things together, oh, that's weird, that thing slid over. As you start to add these pieces together, where I can start to really not only have a unified view, start to collect information, but start to protect them for these specific services that you see here, and growing, which has been pretty impressive. So, again, looking at what we can do for that, the Microsoft Defender for servers specifically, there's integration. You start to see more pop up. Before, Defender for Endpoint was really about just desktops, desktops and laptops and mobile devices. And now it's getting direct integration with inside of the servers itself. There was some that was put into the business licensing. Now they're going to, it's kind of, you're going to see where not only Defender for servers being there, but you're going to start to see it in the Intune management portal. It's not there yet. They've already kind of announced parts of it, but now you have this unified view of it, because again, people normally go on, let's say, a desktop, they access services wherever they are, they deal with data that might have come from a line of business application that's run on a server that runs in GCP, that's being affected, and you want all of those things to essentially work with one another. And so when they access that application, you have a custom built application, let's say, that's running in AWS. And when people log into that, they log in with their Azure AD credentials. A lot of times that they're using, the app has its own username and password, definitely not the way it should go, but let's say it does. They have their own logging, collecting the logs that have the same information that gets pulled together. I mean, you kind of see the point of how these things are working. So when we think about management, it is, normally we start off in the unification of views and applications to services, but then we need to see more. And now with the built-in vulnerability assessment that's inside of this, so you can see the scans that are happening and then look at how we're going to apply those scans. There's different ways, like Qualsys is the one that Microsoft has and uses, but you can, if you have your own license, you can do that thing. But anyway, you're doing that assessment scanning. That assessment scanning now is actually a new service that's built in on the Microsoft 365 side that's tied to Defender for Endpoint there. But you're also getting, this has been actually around a little bit longer on the server side of it, also getting a unified view across all your platforms. And so we've seen customers that have bought a third-party service that deploy its own agent onto that box, but in terms of taking action, well, then they have to buy another service that can take action. And then how do I see all the services? Another one that takes action. And then what about Windows Update if you're not doing the basic one and you're using another service? Well, now you have that. It's nowhere near as unified. So how do you know what's being collected, is taking action, who did it? So there's this benefit to pull them together. Again, from a management side of it. Again, everything here requires care and feeding and knowledge of what's going on. But, the intent here is that, especially on the Microsoft side, that there's a lot of rich integration that works with one of them. And again, the ability for it to be where it exists is really key, especially if you have applications, like I said, in a regulated industry, or you're trying to just figure out where things are, make sure you're not in a bad spot in transition to the cloud or partial transition to the cloud. So here you can see kind of the makeup of information and a lot of the data that starts to get stored, whether it's in the, here it's Defender for storage, because you might have a certain amount of data, so talking to a lot of customers recently where, they have a lot of data that's on-prem, SQL data, it could be MySQL data, whatever that might be, and they have data from other sources. And instead of redoing what their data warehouse is, they're using things like, Azure Data Factory, data lakes, and they want to be able to pull data from other sources, aggregate them, create a warehouse, do in Power BI, whatever that might be. That has to be also accounted for. And some of that data is coming from an on-prem SQL server, as an example, or outside service. How do we protect it? How do I know how things are working? And how do I put them together? So if I can have them in a resource group that's used by our data analytics team, that's pulling data from third-party services, that's pulling data from our on-prem files, whether it's structured or unstructured data, and they're having a unified view. If there's an attack, I need to be able to see all of those services and endpoints so that, from the security side of it, we can investigate it. Lack of information, like, I don't know where that data came in. Somebody goes and they pulled it from a server. Like, which server? I think this one. When was it patched? No, let me go look at it. So now we're just wasting time, which only can further the attack and create more disruption. So again, really trying to push the fact here that it's not just, the visibility, it's all these other scenarios that really start to stack up. So, kind of in conclusion, going through this, really just like we started off with, really hoping that you start to think of, managing these server infrastructure, these endpoints that are more servers, it could be a SQL box, Kubernetes, no matter where it's deployed. Obviously, if it's deployed, if it's in a 20 inches of concrete and steel and there's no internet connection and it's down in the 20 feet of dirt, different. But most of these times, these are cloud connected devices anyway. You either have mature services or you don't, and you're using a lot of third-party pieces, you're trying to hack it together. This is a great step. If you're more sophisticated and you do have a lot of management infrastructure, what's normally happened where you might have been sitting is we have all this infrastructure that we put in place to manage our infrastructure, but so much of it has moved into the cloud that our SharePoint farm and multiple farm with, and our Exchange servers that had a multi-site DAG and then this other thing. And because of all that, we needed all these domain control. We've really gotten smaller, but some things need to stay here. Now my investments in these IT management tools is more than what I really need. What do I go do? So this is another good approach to do that. It's the same thing for when you used to have all that and your desktops that were local AD based, but now they're transitioning to Azure AD based. You start to lean more towards things like Intune and Defender for Endpoint. Same thing here from an infrastructure side of it. And again, you should start small, not think you have to lift and shift everything, and start to see the benefits of defining the structure. When I mean structures, this is for IT, this is for developers, this is for our business units that do need their own servers and data. They have their own SQL, and I can still segment them in the cloud by resource groups. I can still put them in there, give them access to even manage the things that they need through the cloud, and that way I can ensure that they stay within the right policies, they can see their costs, they can, I can give the right oversight to them. We can work together on it versus, well, they need this, they need an admin password, and they constantly break the rules. We got to do that. I mean, there's always going to be little things like that, but now overall in the fabric of your management, you can definitely simplify what's going to happen. And Azure Arc really is a starting point for that. And in terms of how we guide customers through projects on theirs, part of that's it's understanding the size and scope and complexity of the customer, because you could do the CAF model that's in there, that's built-in template, but it is complex. I mean, there's a lot of different management groups of groups, and it's kind of built for the Uber enterprise, and some businesses absolutely need it and others just don't. But you could still leverage some of that framework of your policies and resource groups in order to then target and bring it on board some of your key servers, especially things like the Defender for cloud. One thing I really didn't talk about is Defender for identity, which is really targeted towards local Active Directory, which is really key. I think we'll probably have a topic just on that. But even with that, if I have domain controllers, I would still want to be able to manage those domain controllers through Azure Arc. And if those domain controllers were a part of this hybrid identity that I had with Azure Active Directory, and I'm using Azure AD Connect to synchronize it, two other things I would want on all of my domain controllers: the Azure AD Connect Health agent. Many people forget to deploy that. Put that on all of them because it'll help give you replication information that's on there. And the second is Defender Identity. Yes, it requires a specific license. It might be packaged in yours. You might have to do another one, but it's the one that's seeing all of the logins that happens in your entire local Active Directory environment. You have to put them on all your domain controllers, because anytime a person's on their desktop accesses a file or anything else, it always has to be authenticated. Just because you log in once, whenever you access a server resource, another desktop, it always has to get authenticated. So when it's sitting on Defender for Identity, it's sitting on the domain controller, it pulls that information and pushes it to the cloud. So now you get even more information around what's happening for lateral movement attacks or other kind of MITRE attacks that's out there. So, pick the area that you feel either you have the most concern about, those are the most critical, or things that you just want to start getting more oversight, and start there in terms of collecting and enforcing. But to just get awareness of all your units, think about your deployment strategy for Azure Arc, and then starting to get at least that visibility, and then use that as an approach to what you'll target, what needs to go in, is also perfectly fine. So hopefully this gives you some guidance on why you would want to do it. What are some of the things to think about as you go forward? It's a great service to start leveraging it. I hope you come to us here at Agile IT to kind of scope it out and help you roll these things out. But we typically want to help customers get going themselves, but we also have another service called Agile Max that really is where this is great, we could do it, but can you help us at ongoing with it? And we don't deploy any other agents. Arc is the agent. Defender for Endpoint, that's the agent. So we don't put third-party agents. We like to use whatever's in the Microsoft suite. Anyhow, so that's what I had to talk about today. I appreciate your time, and here we'll in a few take some questions, and you can always reach out to us here at Agile IT to see how we can help you in your journey to using Azure to manage all your other clouds.
Excellent, thank you, Conrad. Now, before we jump into the Q&A session real quick, and we do have a few questions, I wanted to bring up that the next webinar for April will be on application guidance for CMMC and FedRAMP. This is related to a session that you recently gave in person. Do you want to talk a little bit about what we're going to discuss next month?
Sure. So there's a number of people that are building applications that you may have already had an application that you integrated with Azure AD, and really great single sign-on capabilities that you need to meet. And when you try to take that same application, it could be an ISV, you could be building it internally for an internal app, or that you build this app to work with your customers and your partners. When you go into an Azure government tenant, normally GCC High, you're normally going there because you need to meet things like CMMC or FedRAMP High. And in order to make that same application integration to work, it's not only endpoints you have to worry about, but there's some other key aspects in Azure government that you have to think about. And ISVs that have built application specifically to work for customers, because they go, they pay, they have a trial, they click and connect, consent, and want to have that same experience for GCC High customers, they also have to have a tenant. So, applications that have direct integration with Azure AD, that's in commercial or global won't work in GCCI unless they have a tenant and do some other configuration there. So that's what we're going to walk through. So if you've built anything that's there, that's helpful. If you're going to think about building an application that you're in GCC high, then this specifically is going to help you out. And we've had ISVs that we've worked with that, aren't, they're going to stay all commercial or wherever their email is, but they just need this environment to host their identity. That Microsoft does a great job of meeting, ITAR requirements, FedRAMP High. So that kind of shared responsibility, they get to just leverage it and leverage the identity so they can support their customers. So we're going to talk about that framework, kind of things to think about. What would you need minimum for licensing? What would you do split tenancies? But really focus on the application side of it.
Great, thanks, Conrad. So the first question is not a question, it's a comment that popped in there in the middle of somebody was confirming the $750 per server per month for Azure Arc. So you were spot on there.
Right.
The other question, it appears that they answered it themselves, was looking for the Microsoft Defender for Cloud inventory screen in GCC High, and if you knew what that endpoint was.
The endpoint for Defender for Cloud, like what the actual URL is. I don't remember the actual URL to it. Oh,
right. Give me a moment. I might be able to get that. Now, this question I think might be a little bit out of scope, but it's interesting. I recently read on LinkedIn about advanced malware that is able to get around Defender. Any comments, and at what level or area does that have traction?
I caught wind of something like that too. I don't know the answer to it. Anything that's revolved around like Defender and the security pieces. I mean, it's one thing that we have to be mindful of and check all the time, but it's one that we leverage so much on the Microsoft side for their security investments that they do to stay on top of it. And that's the world of security, isn't it? I mean, you build one thing, they work one way around it. Then it's just like you go to people, you see people's houses, and they'll have like a double bolted metal screen, but there's no bars on their windows. Put bars on the windows. Well, now we have this other thing. So there's a constant view of this, which only tells me that, well, one, from the Microsoft side, we want to keep mindful. Again, I don't know the answer for it, but it only plays well into what we're talking about here today, is that not thinking people are trying to attack you is always the poor stance. You really, zero trust and a good security posture means I constantly feel that somebody is directly trying to hack me, and then work from there. And people say, well, these attackers don't know me. Matter of fact, sometimes they do. Many times they aren't looking for you, but they are trying to, they will eventually find you through other methods. So, think about how you can, what happens under attack? Do I have my data? Are things there? Who has access to it? Is key. And so all this is part of it. But to that direct question, I don't have any other kind of notes on it.
All right. And it kind of depends. There are two that were out there in the wild. There's only one left right now. One is Black Lotus, which actually goes against Secure Boot, and it's patchable, but it's patchable to avoid the exploit coming in from the side. And I'm going to paste an article right now from Security Week. The one that Google announced this week was actually patched yesterday, and we're safe again. And Conrad, from what you've shown me, seems like you can manage those patches and make sure that your entire environment's secure with what you've demonstrated today.
Yeah, I mean, it's as long as there's other systems that we have out there and applications, there's always going to be patching. There's no such thing as the perfect product. There's always going to be updates, and many times we don't always want those patches rolled out automatically for us. Sometimes we want to delay because the application, one thing that normally comes from CV scanning is like, patch this because it can be vulnerable. Well, if you're not using it, you definitely should patch it. But sometimes you design your application with that vulnerability in mind, and you have to, so you might have to change your application or test it again. So this is where IT and developers and providers need to always kind of work together on this thing.
Always. Well, I am not seeing any more questions coming up in the panel right now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop recording and say thank you to everybody who is watching this on YouTube in the future. And we will be sending out the recording link as soon as that's up. But thank you very much, Conrad.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. Thanks, everybody. Excited. Have you guys next one for the next talk.